You're all very welcome to today's webinar. Our webinar is on anxiety in 18 to 24-year-olds. Just to let everybody know, the event is being recorded, so we'll have access to the recording afterwards. We have a chat function there, so you can put some questions in that. And Erica, who's on my top right-hand side of the screen, will be moderating the questions for us today. So thanks for that, Erica. So without further ado, just I'll introduce you to the speaker for today. Anybody who has been with us before will know it's Mark Smith. Mark is a psychologist with CAMHS, and he's also the 2020 president of the Psychological Society of Ireland.
Thanks, Una. Okay, all set. Thanks again for everybody for joining again today, which is the third in the series of 4 that we're running in conjunction with CYPSC. So one thing that we know is that anxiety as an emotion will impact on everybody in slightly different ways. But I suppose there are different challenges depending on where you're at in terms of your stage of development, where the anxiety, the feeling of anxiety might feel the same, but the particular pressures and stressors that we might encounter can be slightly different. So what we're going to try and do today is look specifically at this group of 18 to 24-year-olds. What I'm going to do is just take you through some of the particular challenges that are maybe not totally unique to this group, but maybe impact on that a little bit more than other ages. And then we're going to move into looking specifically at anxiety and then how we might manage it, in particularly with this group. So this time of kind of 18 to 24, and when we look at it, it is a time of transition again. And in previous webinars, we've talked about the challenges of transitioning between primary school and secondary school. And again, young people have come through this maelstrom of adolescence and all the changes that are happening. And then they hit 18 and more transitions come. And what we know is that with transitions come uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the factors that will feed anxiety, because anxiety is about a fear of the unknown, about not knowing what's going to come. And what I'm going to try and do is look through just some of the particular issues of transition and uncertainty that really impact on this group. So a young person's sense of their identity, who they are and who they might be, the concept of legally being an adult, if college is in their future, or if there might be work, or if there's concerns about unemployment, about independence, both practically and emotionally, about the differing changes that can happen in a relationship with parents and how that can impact on anxiety for all involved, the basics of a place to live. And I think success can be a big factor in relation to anxiety for young adults and their perceptions of what success is, how it's measured, and how it's perceived by others. So when we look at people when they reach 18, in terms of some of the developmental changes that will occur, in general, and this is not for all cases, but in general, when we hit this age range, people do tend to be just a little less impulsive, a little less driven by their hormones and what's happening in the moment than they were maybe when they were a younger teenager. They do tend to have a little bit more stable relationships. They don't tend to be as up and down with peer groups changing as often as they would have been in the past. And there's a little bit more stability there, which I think helps in terms of that sense of who I am and who I am in relation to others. The physical appearance mostly has been complete in terms of the body's maturation. The brain, as I'll talk about a little bit later on, does still continue to mature until roughly about the age of 24, but most of the physical changes have taken part. Young people in this age group do have somewhat of more of an increased awareness of the consequences of their thoughts, of their behaviors, of their actions. But having this increased awareness isn't always a positive thing for everybody. So one of the challenges that I have when working with young people in this range, and one of the complaints that they have and what they struggle with, is that they would tell me that they overthink everything. So because they have an increased awareness, what if I do this? And what if this person happens? What if I make this choice? And what's interesting when I have this conversation with them when they are particularly anxious, it's interesting is that they don't actually tend to overthink, because when anxiety is the lens in which that they look at their choices through, the overthinking tends to be predominantly towards the negative. So when I say, okay, maybe you do overthink everything. Can you tell me, do you overthink all of these positive outcomes that might occur? And they kind of look at me blankly and go, well, no. Okay, well, then you're not overthinking. You are just over in one particular, through one particular lens or through one aspect of it. But there are so many different thoughts and questions and options that occur when they reach young adulthood. For many, that can feel overwhelming because they fear making the wrong choice and what the implications of that might be. And if we look at it, when in maybe the earlier period of adolescence, from kind of 16 to 18, they hit 5th year and 6th year, and lots of questions start getting asked by teachers, by parents, by adults, by friends. What do you want to be for the rest of your life? Now, that's a huge question. And that's something that a lot of young people are very, very uncertain about. But they do feel a pressure. Am I going to be a businessman, a teacher, a lawyer, a doctor, a scientist, or I don't know? And this pressure, again, tied into succeed, that if you choose your CAO points right now and you get the course that you want, this is your career mapped out for the rest of your life. But we don't know. I think for me, certainly when I entered psychology at 18, did I know I would still be in it this many years later? No, I wasn't sure. I knew what the idea of psychology might be like, but the actual application of it or being a job was something I was uncertain about. So we all deal with that when we enter a new role. But for a young person to think that this would form part of their core identity for the next 40 years until at least they retire and probably afterwards, that's a huge piece to try and wrap your head around. We're also seeing that around the age of 18, the Leaving Cert has been on the horizon for many years. And for many, it's something that will be in the year ahead. So with the Leaving Cert comes many challenges, many anxieties, some which are understandable. So the anxiety of wanting to do well, of wanting to get the results, that's an understandable anxiety. But many young people will set really, really high, sometimes unrealistic expectations and standards of what the Leaving Cert needs to be for them to be good enough. I meet many young people, young adults, who would struggle to have a very or any positive sense of who they are. When you ask them about what's good about them, they can't identify many things. But for young people who maybe intellectually and academically are quite strong, a lot of their sense of being good enough is tied up in their academics. So this is a very challenging time if your identity and your sense of being good enough is tied up on an academic result. The big worry is if I don't get what I think I need to be or what I should get, what does that mean for me in terms of being a good enough person? A lot of that is self-driven, it's expectations on self, or sometimes it's comparisons. And young adults do look around at their peers. What did you get? What are you aiming for? And they will make judgments about being good based on other people as well. There is huge pressure to succeed. So every year when the results come out, we have the points race. We see increases in points. We see high courses that have gone up. Psychology has gone up quite a lot this year. So there is an anxiety about, will I get it? I've put in at least 2 years of the Leaving Cert cycle of work, and study, and effort, and blood, and sweat, and tears. Will it be enough? And that anxiety of knowing if that outcome is going to happen, despite all the work that I've put into it. There is also a reality, I suppose, and I've come to terms with this over the last couple of years working with young people. It's not for everybody. And that there can be this pressure and expectation that I have to stay in the Leaving Cert cycle, irrespective of the impact that it has on me, on my anxiety levels, on my stress, on my mental health. But for those who, for many different reasons, decide that actually completing the Leaving Cert isn't right for them in that moment, that in itself can cause a lot of anxiety. So the question of, did I make the right choice to drop out? Was it, when I'm balancing up my mental health and my future and what success might be for me, did I make the right choice? Young people sometimes will think, okay, it's not for me right now. I'll take a gap year, I'll do a little bit of work, and then I'll go back afterwards and do it in maybe a different school. But there's the uncertainty of, well, once I've got a taste for work, will it be too hard? So lots and lots of what if thoughts. It's also, every year when the results come out, not always a positive and joyous time for everybody. And especially for those perhaps who didn't finish out the Leaving Cert cycle. So when they see Leaving Cert nights out, when they see their friends celebrating, that can be quite an anxious and sometimes lonely time for them. There's also worries about their own perception of, if I don't do the Leaving Cert, am I a failure? Will people see me as a failure? Will I be able to get a job if I don't have the Leaving Cert? So a lot of anxieties can happen for those young people who, for a variety of different reasons, the Leaving Cert isn't something that's completely right for them. I think one thing to bear in mind as well when we look at this particular cohort is that there has been huge generational shifts from my parents, my grandparents, to young people now. In my grandparents, certainly, and to a degree, my parents' time, my grandparents, not many people did the Leaving Cert at all. They got a job at 15 and they were working. My parents' time, a little bit after that, if you got your Leaving Cert, that was you sorted. You get yourself into a civil service job, and that's it. You have a job for life and you're doing okay. In the last couple of years, maybe the last 10 years, the Leaving Cert certainly doesn't guarantee an entry, a smooth entry into the workforce. What we've also seen is either does a degree, so that the threshold by which we can have some degree of certainty about finding some employment in an area that we like has moved on, and that for many it ends up being a postgraduate. So this perception of what I need to have in order to increase my chances of success, whatever that might mean to the individual, has changed over the generations. What we also see is lots of young people who see and perceive that there are other routes to success, to fame, to money, be it through social media channels, through TikTok, through reality TV shows, that the perception of what is success to each person is very different, and how others might perceive it could be different. So for a young person, a young adult who goes down the social media route and perceives that to be something as a success, the others, the older adults, other people might look at it and not perceive it the same way. So success and what a young person, a young adult perceives to be that will depend on so many different factors. And that in itself can be anxiety provoking. There is also maybe a perception that once we have achieved our points and we've got our course, that we've got our number 1 or number 2 or 3 selection on the CAO, that I've got into my course, that means I will complete it. I have met many young people who have got through maybe the first year of their chosen course, believed that this was the course, the career, the pathway to success that I have wanted for so long. And for a lot of different reasons, their direct experience of that course hasn't met their expectations or their hopes, or it was something they didn't believe it to be. So it is not always the case that enrolling in a university or college course will result in graduation, because there are lots of different changes from the school environment that they may have come for. So the expectation for many courses in college is, here's the work, here's the essay, go and do it. And there's less overt supervision or nudging or checking, and there's an expectation of independence. But also for a lot of young people, the adaptation in terms of learning and the teaching styles can be quite different. So there would be less emphasis in many college courses on rote learning and an expectation of independent thought, analysis, reflection. And that not may come easily to all young people. And that in itself could be a little bit anxiety provoking. It is important to also bring back to, I think, Maslow's hierarchy of basic needs that we look at, and we think about the intellectual learning that we might encounter between 18 and 24. But we still ought to have to look at the basics of what we all need. And we see it every year for as many years as I can remember. And again, this year, that I've got my college course, and if you're a student from Dublin trying to go to Galway, but can I get accommodation? Have I somewhere to live? Will I have to commute? Will I miss out on things because I've got to commute and I can't find anywhere, or I worry that my parents won't be able to afford the accommodation and the burden that I'll place on them? So the very basics of where I can live can be something that will be a burden to people, or having to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to get a bus commute to be able to go to their college of choice. So again, these are all, it's a great time, it's an exciting time, it's a reward for everything that they've done, but it doesn't mean that there isn't also a lot of uncertainty, anxieties that they would still have to face. If that situation arises where college just doesn't go as expected, and the young person reaches, I think, quite a difficult conclusion that this isn't for me, they can really struggle with what do I do now? I'm 19, I have to reevaluate what I was trying to do at 16, 17 of what do I want to study? What do I want to work at? How do I do this? And even having that conversation with a parent can be exceptionally difficult for this cohort. I've had young people who have been attending me who their parents don't know that they've dropped out of college because they experience overwhelming anxiety and also shame, which is a really difficult emotion that I believe that I failed myself. I believe I failed my parents. What if they're disappointed in me? What if they think I'm a failure? Where do I go now? So these are possibilities that we have to consider and do our best, I suppose, to support young people through if this happens. I've long struggled with the idea of 18 in itself being a, I think, somewhat arbitrary threshold for being an adult. We have the legal concept of adulthood. So we know legally within the law, but that in itself, I think, is quite a blunt instrument. So while the law might regulate and believe you to be an adult, does that mean that you will always see yourself as an adult? And being an adult and having that independence can bring huge anxieties and responsibilities. Many young people are not necessarily ready to feel that responsible, to be an adult, and that shift into that model of thinking. And as I mentioned earlier, the brain does still keep developing until roughly about the age of 24. But in the middle of all of this, we have this expectation and pressure to be an adult and everything that comes with that. When we become an adult, and as we talked about in some of the other podcasts that we've done, or the seminars that we've done, with anxiety, one of the cognitive aspects of things is a predominance of thoughts that start with what if. And with increased responsibility comes increased fear. What if I make a mistake? And now as an 18, 19, 20-year-old, the responsibility for that mistake now lies on me. So with younger children, they are somewhat cocooned within the support of their families and the parents who will help them adjust and adapt to whatever particular mistakes might be. For many young adults, they internalize this expectation of you're an adult now, it's on you if you make the mistake. And that can be difficult given all of the multitude of choices that they have, and trying to get it right from their perspective in each of these different scenarios can be incredibly difficult for them to do. I think one thing that has come up in much of the work that I've done with young adults and with their parents is that a process of, I think, redefining what the parent-child/adult-child relationship is going to be. So for in many families, it's, well, you're under 18, you're a child, you're in my house, I have the decision-making power over what you do, where you go, how you do it. But now they are entitled to drive, they're entitled to drink, they're entitled to vote, they're legally an adult. And for many parents and young people, this is a very difficult renegotiation. We've got parental anxiety over, I can't tell them what to do. They're going out, they're drinking, what time are you going to be home at? I know into my mid-20s, I would come home from college, go home, and I'd be going out with friends, and the question would still be asked, what time will you be home? And will it be an okay hour in my mid-20s? So this relationship that young adults have with their parents does need to be redefined. It is something that causes anxiety for both. And that's something that's a process that can't be assumed will happen, but needs, where possible, for communication and honest communication to happen between the parent and their now legally adult child. Again, looking at this concept of independence, that you're an adult, you're independent, you can make legal choices for yourself, you can make medical choices, but there are also big caveats. So I want independence and I'm told I'm independent, but for the vast majority of young adults, they are still completely and utterly legally or financially dependent on their parents for college fees, for getting to college, for day-to-day living expenses, for things that come up. They still require the support of their parents. And for, I think, the vast majority, they're also not independent in terms of where they would live. They still require the support, the help, the practical somewhere to live from their parents, be that in the parents' home or the parents' support to live in college accommodation, or maybe somewhere where they might be working. So there's a dilemma between, I feel independent and I want to be, but I'm still required to be somewhat dependent on my parents. So that can create some tensions and some anxieties. So looking a bit more specifically about anxiety in itself and how that impacts on people. So anxiety has two kind of components. One would be the emotional and physical aspect, and the other is the cognitive. And both are interrelated and feed off each other. So with the anxiety, the cognitive piece of things, it's worry or fear about things that are real or imagined. That's a really important differentiation. It doesn't have to be something that is a definite bad thing that's going to happen. The imaginary piece, the worrying about some event, catastrophic event in the future that hasn't happened yet, that in itself can be anxiety provoking. So maybe a young adult, maybe where parents are that little bit older, they're getting, maybe their health is not the best. They're worried about in the future what happens if my mum or dad gets ill and if they die. Will I be alone? Will I be able to support this house and myself? What will I do? So this is an imagined situation in the future, but in that moment, it can be quite significant in relation to the young adult's anxiety. So anxiety is something that we struggle with, not just because of the thoughts that we have. If it was just the thoughts, it would be tricky, but maybe that more manageable. But our thoughts and our anxieties interact physically with our body. So we have been genetically pre-programmed to respond to threat for thousands of years, and our body gets ready. And many of you will be familiar with the idea of fight or flight. And there's also freeze. So when we perceive a threat, our body reacts in a way to either fight or to get away. So our heart pounds, we feel nauseous, our muscles get tense, our legs might shake, difficulty sleeping, feel a bit nauseous, restless. And when you combine those with all of the what if thoughts, it feels very, very overwhelming and something that we want to stop, we want to get away from. And it can really have a significant impact on our day-to-day existence. So when we look at the cycle and how the thoughts and the feelings interact with each other, we'll take an example of somebody out for a run. So in that moment, as many of us will know, when we're running, we're breathing a little bit faster, our heart is working a little bit harder, our muscles are a little bit tense. But if someone is that a little bit more predisposed to being anxious, they're feeling that heart moving faster, they're feeling the muscles tense. And when they look at those physiological symptoms through the lens of anxiety, one of the catastrophic thoughts that they might have are, I'm having a heart attack. Now, the simple answer in that moment is, well, I'm exercising and I'm unfit. But through that anxious lens, it's more a catastrophic thought. So they're feeling anxiety, they're feeling terror, they're feeling adrenaline, their heart racing, palpitations, they're agitated. And when they focus on those particular feelings and those physiological feelings, they engage in something called a confirmation bias. So I'm feeling quite anxious, I'm having a heart attack, therefore my heart beats faster. And I interpret that heart beating faster, not as me being anxious, but confirmation that I'm having a heart attack. So I need to sit down, I need to stop running. The heart slows down, feel a little bit nauseous, the fear starts to recede a little bit. And the thought that the person has, so they feel relief. But they also believe that they've stopped something catastrophic. So I stopped myself from having a heart attack. I stopped myself from dying. So this cycle will happen of needing to avoid something that we think is going to prevent a catastrophic event. And we can get stuck when we notice those physical sensations. So the next time going for a walk or something just random happens in our body and we notice it because we're internally focused. And again, this cycle starts of, this is a heart attack, starting again. The other piece about anxiety is, and I would say this to a person, does it ever get exhausting thinking so much, being so anxious? And they will always say yes. And again, for young adults, be that going to college or maybe starting into the work, when they're really, really anxious, it's physically and mentally really, really tiring. One of the most anxiety provoking times for many people is going to bed at night. They're not distracted, they're lying there and there's no filter in their brain, and they're looking back on maybe things that they did that day, things they think they did wrong. They're thinking about tomorrow, they're thinking about next week, of things that they've got to do, and their brain is flooded with what ifs and also negative judgments of what they've already done. And that in itself can just make them tired. It uses a huge amount of emotional energy, but also when it impacts on sleep, it can be very, very difficult to concentrate on everyday things, be that a task that they might have in work or an assignment in college or a lecture to concentrate. So anxiety can have a knock-on effect on sleep, which makes them tired, or in the moment, if your head is flooded with what-if thoughts and running through loads of catastrophic scenarios, it's very difficult to leave many resources to concentrate on what's happening in the here and now. So what I've always tried to do is to differentiate between when anxiety is a normal, justifiable, understandable response, which we'll come to in a little bit, and when we need to know when it's a problem. So for young adults, for young people who have problematic anxiety, it's a really significant amount of anxiety and stress and embarrassment on an almost daily basis. It's not an occasional thing, a situational thing, it's almost daily. And the anxiety that the person is experiencing is so emotionally painful that they start to avoid situations either entirely, or they will endure them and really, really high level of distress while they're doing it. And then afterwards be exhausted because they've had to endure it. So for some, the idea of maybe failing at college, they start to skip the odd assignment, skip the odd lecture because they're worried about what might happen. And that feeling of the relief from the anxiety that they get from skipping it can then have a domino effect, and it becomes this way that they try to avoid situations that they think will trigger the anxiety. In terms of the social anxiety piece, for many young adults, they're caught between a rock and a hard place, because what they really want to do is to create a favorable impression. I've started a new job, I've gone to college, I'm now an adult, I've got a new peer group, I'm away from school, this is a fresh start. But if they have a lot of insecurities about their self-worth, their belief in themselves, trying to create a favorable impression while also being really insecure about our ability to do it can be very difficult and very anxiety provoking. So when someone struggles with anxiety, be that a teenager or a young adult or an adult, they engage in things called safety behaviors that they believe protects them from judgment and protects them from the feeling of anxiety. So if one of the symptoms of anxiety that they struggle with might be blushing, or they worry about making eye contact with somebody because they fear that looking at someone will invoke judgment, they might wear high neck tops to cover blushing on the neck, or they wear their hair long and over their eyes to kind of try to disguise the blushing. Eye contact might be something that they will avoid, again, to avoid being noticed, or apologizing consistently because they assume that they've done something wrong, that they've made a mistake, either socially or in something that they've done. But the other person is really confused about, why are they apologizing? I don't understand. And in that situation, and in many situations, what the person does is their internal feeling of anxiety, they project it onto the people around them, and they feel that, well, if I feel this anxious and if I feel I've done something wrong, then you must have noticed it too. Other avoidance strategies and safety behaviors would be to make excuses. So there's a party coming up, there's an activity happening, creating an excuse to justify why they don't go, and because they can't say, I'm too anxious to go. Or a party comes or an event comes and they go make a short appearance and then make an excuse to leave because the anxiety builds up so much that they feel that the only way that they can cope with it is to escape and to avoid. So in terms of what works, we've covered this a few times before. Reassurance in itself, it's a nice idea, and telling someone it'll be grand, it'll probably never happen. It's a lovely idea, but it doesn't work for the person. So when they're feeling anxious about something, their heart is pounding, their stomach is nauseous, they're predicting all sorts of catastrophic events. In that moment, telling them it's going to be okay, it'll be grand, it'll never happen, is not reassuring, because their body is in alert mode. It's ready to run, it's ready to fight, and nothing about what they're feeling feels right. So it doesn't feel reassuring. And what happens is that most of the things that we're anxious about are theoretically possible. But what happens is that anxiety magnifies the odds of it. So prior to coming on this call, I was having some technical issues in connecting. My anxiety levels were starting to rise a little bit. What happens if I can't get on? What happens if it has to be cancelled? And then you notice those. We make a call to the technician, we will find a way, I'll do it on my phone. But anxiety makes us feel like the odds of this is all going to fall apart seem much more real. When we try to support someone who's feeling anxious, one of the most important things that we can all do for ourselves and for others is to understand anxiety, to understand what it is. And I love this quote that we only fear what we don't understand. And for many of us, and for many young people, they don't have a good understanding of what anxiety is. And the more that we understand something, the less that we fear it, including fear itself, which is what anxiety is and what it provokes. It provokes fear. And the more that we understand that, the less scary it's going to be. The other things that we need to do in each situation is, so we need to have varying degrees of anxiety in response to whatever the perceived or actual threat is going to be. So in ourselves or when we talk to others to ask, is the degree of panic and anxiety justified to the situation that we're in? So if we're driving along and our brakes suddenly fail and we get really, really anxious, yeah, that's completely justified. If we're driving along on the road and there's no other cars around and we're getting a panic attack about, am I going to crash right now and die? In terms of that threat perception, that's probably not as justified. So we need to be able to have a proportionate response to what the level of threat is, not what the anxiety tells us it is at the moment. Also, one of the most important things that we can do for ourselves and for others when we're feeling anxious is to validate it. That I can see why you're anxious. I can see why it's anxiety provoking to think about crashing the car. That makes sense. So a person who's feeling anxious is worried about being judged. And if we can emotionally connect with them and justify to them that it makes sense why you're anxious, the level of perception of threat might be different, but I understand you. I understand why you're so anxious. That in itself can assist a person to not feel as anxious because I don't feel as alone. And what we know about anxiety, and this is the hard part about it, is that the more that we can sit with it, where we can hold on, that the anxiety will pass. It doesn't feel like that and we fear that it won't. But when we support a person through the anxiety, the path through it will always be quicker. For many people, the belief is similar to this gentleman down on the bottom, is that I can prevent anxiety from happening. And that is the equivalent of walking into the sea with your arms out and thinking you can prevent the waves. Anxiety is one of our emotions. It's going to keep coming throughout our lives. And when we accept that fact and when we accept that it's going to keep happening, then we're in a better place to be able to manage that. But if we go down to our local beach up at the top left, 90% of the waves that come in will be mild, we won't notice them, and they move back out. And that is for most anxieties. Each one of us have probably 100 anxieties, things we worry about every day. And they come, we notice them, and they pass. A much smaller percentage of time, the wave gets a little bit bigger. It's a little bit more threat there. We get a bit more anxious. And whatever that level of threat, it passes. A much smaller amount of time again, a big wave comes in, it hits us in the chest, it hurts, we feel really anxious, really panicky, and it will pass. And in a very, very small amount of time, a huge tidal wave of anxiety is going to come in. It's going to hit us, knock us to the ground, we can't breathe, it hurts, it's scary, and then it will pass. And I would talk to many young adults about this, and they look at me with a degree of skepticism. Well, you don't really know that, and how can you be really sure? And a very simple question to ask is, tell me about the last time you had a panic attack and how difficult that was. And they will relate that story to me. And then we think, well, are you that degree of anxious right now? Are you panicking right now? No. So it's the person's direct experience of seeing that anxiety cannot stay at a catastrophic tidal wave level all the time, gives them the mechanism to understand that it doesn't always have to be so overwhelming. So how we manage anxiety is by actually surrendering towards it. And if we believe anxiety is always bad and not sometimes fun or helpful or protective to us, if we see it as the enemy, it will keep us stuck. So when we can accept that it is a normal, typical, justifiable human emotion that sometimes gets a little out of sync, and that we can be compassionate with ourselves and feel it's okay that I'm anxious. I'm not weak for being anxious. There's nothing wrong with me for being anxious. When we embrace that, then it has much less of a power over us. So for many of you might be familiar with the term CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, and that looks at the cognitions and the thoughts and the worries and the what if thoughts. It also looks at the behaviors. And as we talked about already, many of the behaviors when people struggle with anxiety is about the avoidance. So when we're trying to support someone through it, the direct experience is so much more important than cognition. So I can have many sessions with a young adult in the room where we think about what it might be like to order a coffee, to take a trip on the bus, to go to a party. And the idea of it, we can come to terms of what might happen. But that anxiety of the what if scenarios is still there. And I can't and don't reassure a person that it will always be perfect. It will be good enough. What we need to do is to support the person to do the experience. And the key piece with anxiety for the person themselves, most importantly, but also in the work, is that they would go through an experience and see that it wasn't as bad as I thought, or as my anxiety predicted it would be. So we would go back and think, before this party, what did you think was going to happen? I thought no one would talk to me. I thought I'd fall on my face. I thought I'd vomit everywhere. I thought that people would just ignore me. And actually, that didn't happen. So what we're trying to do is undermine the strength of the beliefs that anxiety kind of places, its ability to predict the future. So how we do that is through creating an exposure hierarchy for whatever the particular anxiety might be. So we look at a situation that only creates a little bit of anxiety, and that causes the highest, and we move towards it. So that could be just asking someone for directions, up as far as the worst possible thing of joining a football club and being with lots of different people. So the most important piece of a hierarchy is about what the actions are, and seeing that I did it, and building that confidence that even though I felt anxious, I still managed to do it. So with this hierarchy, the idea is that you're exposing the person to increasing amounts of anxiety, that the person feels that they can cope with it in increasing amounts. So the hierarchy has to involve the person becoming anxious, but in a way and to a degree that they don't feel so overwhelmed that they feel that they need to try and get away from it. It's also about practicing and trying to change the focus of our attention. So when we get very, very anxious and our heart is pounding and our stomach is in knots and our mind is racing, we bring the focus of our attention inward. We can't concentrate, and the more we focus on our heart pounding, the more we focus on our stomach being in knots, the more we believe that something catastrophic is going to happen. So many of you will probably deal with the concept of mindfulness. And when we get anxious, trying to shift the focus of our attention away from our thoughts, away from the physiological symptoms, onto something external, allows the feeling to actually pass. And it will pass, but we talk to ourselves, we coping statements. I'm feeling really anxious right now. I've moved inside my head and thinking about my what if thoughts. I'm going to focus on the sound, smell, somebody else talking, something that I'm doing. I'm going to consciously bring the focus of my attention externally to myself. It is also important that when we have become maybe a little reliant on avoidance as a way of managing that anxiety, to try to find some people that we're comfortable with, to be with others. And being with others, and particularly people that we might be close to, if that's possible, it's very validating by just being with them that I'm good enough. So for someone who's anxious, about what way can I gently, in a way that I can manage or support other people to manage, to increase their human contact with others, whatever that might, through family or a structured activity. And I think structured activities in particular are helpful if possible, because they're predictable. We're not relying on if someone might be free, if they're interested in going out. We know that on a Thursday at 8, I have this activity, and it's consistent. But also it's less anxiety provoking because we're there for the same purpose. We don't need to wonder about, do we have anything in common? Would we talk about something that, shared interest? Because we're already there for the same purpose, which assists with that anxiety piece. I think it's also, just to touch on it, quite difficult in this 18 to 24 group for parents who have adult children. Because again, like we talked about, this redefining of the relationship about, I want them to succeed. I want them to be happy. I want them to do well in work, in their job, in relationships. But I'm anxious about letting go. I'm anxious about them making a mistake and me not being there to help them. But one of the things that I would suggest considering would be that when, as parents with younger children, we're kind of standing behind them, or we're nudging them, and we're guiding them. As they become young adults, it's about walking that path beside them, about seeing the world as they do, and being on the journey with them, but not steering them on that journey anymore. But also maybe that concept of, I can't prevent them from falling, but if something difficult happens, if they get overwhelmed, they get particularly anxious, I'm there to catch them after they fall. But as an adult, as a parent, having that sense of acceptance that I can't prevent them from falling anymore, and that it is part of that journey of adulthood that we will be falling, and that I can assist at times to help that person to move back up again. Cover a lot of content of this, and I know that it is going to be recorded, but most of the reading content that I cover on anxiety is on this blog, wanderingmindofapsychologist.com. So if you prefer to read, it is there if some of the ideas that I've talked about, maybe you'd like to go back on again. If a young person maybe struggles with social anxiety in particular, Social Anxiety Ireland is a charity that I've worked with for many, many years, who run both online and in pre-COVID world, in-face groups for people who struggle with social anxiety. And there's a great sense of feeling understood, of feeling not lonely anymore when you can connect with other people who feel anxious. There is, within this kind of pyramid of support for young adults, for the vast majority of people, family, friends, this jigsaw concept of one good adult, one good friend, self-help books, self-directed learning will be okay for the vast majority of people. For those maybe where the anxiety gets a little foothold into them, in college, they might have excellent student counselling services. Within the community, for those who have a medical card, they can access the Counselling and Primary Care Service, primary care psychology, jigsaw to the age of 24, or the private options might be through the Psychological Society of Ireland, Find a Psychologist. For those that the anxiety has become so overwhelming, your local adult mental health service, which you would access through your GP, would be there. And then in a very small number of cases, a young person might need more day-to-day support with their anxiety, maybe through a day hospital, or in very small number of cases, an inpatient referral. So again, as always, thank you to everyone for listening, and happy to take any questions that might be there.
Just, can everyone hear me okay? Just while we're waiting to see if maybe some question comes in, I guess I had a question. You know, a lot of young people will be 18, they will go on to college or university. Some of them will go on to work or training programs. I guess I'm wondering about making that shift as a parent when you see your young person take on the responsibility of a job, of being expected to be somewhere every day and do work that you're paid to do. You know, how do parents manage that bit if they're noticing their young person's anxiety getting the better of them, if they're noticing behaviours around maybe starting to avoid work or going in late, and how they kind of manage that balance of it is a young person's job, it's their responsibility, but they're the parent watching this happen?
It's a good question, Erica. I think gently. I think sometimes as a parent, maybe when your own anxiety, we have to be conscious that we might be projecting our anxieties onto them and our hopes and dreams and worries about them. But I think in the first instance, that gently, you know what, I was just noticing I was a little bit worried that, you know, you seem to find it hard to get up over the last few days. Is everything okay? So I think a wondering, gentle inquiry in the first instance, rather than maybe the instinct and influenced by your own anxiety, might be, you know, you need to get up or you're going to get fired. You know, they know that, and that's what the outcome might be. But if we gently inquire first, it's not likely to become as much of a risk of it becoming a battle of you're telling me what to do and I'm not a child anymore and I know, and then it becomes not about the fact that they were struggling getting up for work. It becomes about other dynamics from their earlier teenage years. So I mean, ultimately, as an adult, as a parent, can we force them to get up? No. But if we show some compassion and say, you know, is work really tiring? Have you got an awful lot on? You seem to be very tired. Anything I can do to help? That's not directly kind of coming at them if you didn't go. That, I think, is more likely to get a receptive response.
Okay, thanks very much for that. We have a question coming in. So for young people suffering from social anxiety, what kind of treatment strategies do you use to help them make friends at college?
Great question. What I would suggest is within kind of Freshers Week is activities. So when you go into a lecture hall, for my undergrad, I went to UCD and Theatre L, and you go in, it's a massive amphitheatre of 600 people. And each lecture you go into, you're going to be sitting between different people. And it's difficult, this idea of just striking up a conversation with, hi, who are you? And, you know, my name's Mark or whatever. But when Freshers Week happens and they have loads and loads of different activities, again, this idea of I'm finding like-minded individuals. a general social conversation is we're trying to suss each other out to see our values, our beliefs, what we like, what we don't like. Whereas when it's activity based, you're already starting from a baseline. We have something in common. But I would also encourage that parents might encourage a young person to join as many as possible. So if they just think, well, look, I'm just going to join football or drama, if that perhaps for lots of different reasons doesn't work out, what have we got left? So when I joined college, coming up from Laois, first time away from home, terrified, didn't know anybody, and I joined 10 different clubs and societies. Half of them I had no interest in, but it was an interesting thing. And I found over the course of the next few months, 2 or 3 that I enjoyed and I stayed with. So to encourage them to as much activity-based stuff as possible, because also it's built into the routine. You know, they're meeting for hockey on a Thursday, or there's drama on a Tuesday, or whatever it's going to be. And then the person has some predictability about, here's a place that I can go where I know I get to interact with people. It's not an anxiety of going into a lecture hall and sitting down going, will anybody talk to me? And I think it just gives that opportunity for those possibilities of those social interactions blossoming after
that. Thank you. Lots of comments saying thank you very much. And that's a very helpful comment, just mentioning that Jigsaw support young people up to the age of 25.
Very good clarification. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm just also thinking maybe if you want to say anything for young people who are attending CAMS and then are transitioning to the adult mental health service, if you want to say, you know, if you have any advice for parents around how they continue to support their young people, knowing that it will be a different involvement than what they might have had with CAMS.
Yeah, that is the idea of transitions between mental health services is especially anxiety provoking. It is difficult for a parent if they have been involved in CAMS where they might have been kind of central to the work that might have been happening, to then have to take maybe somewhat more of a back seat, and that can be anxiety provoking for the young person too. So I think for the young person, it would be important to them to have conversations with their new team about the amount of involvement they would like their parent to have and give their consent for that. I think the other thing that I want to tell people about, I suppose, is that work has begun as of 3 weeks ago within the HSE and Department of Health in looking at improving and strengthening the communication between adults and CAMS, and the hope is that will happen quite quickly. And as part of sharing the vision, what the government envisage is that youth mental health services actually will move on to up to the age of 25. It's not going to happen immediate, but it is something that's working on. And I'm involved in that group, and I do hope it's going to kind of come to fruition quite quickly.
Okay, thanks very much. A helpful interaction here for those with high levels of anxiety who may have had the worst case scenarios repeatedly occur. I'm assuming that means severe panic attacks. Can you suggest any alternative strategies or approaches?
I suppose if the worst case scenarios have happened, and they do happen, I've had many young people who would have had kind of contamination fears and fears about sickness and illness, who were predicting global pandemics and it'll never happen, and then so globally we've seen the reality of that happening. I think that the most important thing in the first instance is empathy, and I see it a lot with young people where they fear that their friends are going to leave them, they'll be left alone, and then sometimes that has happened. So I think what's really important is to validate to them how difficult and upsetting and horrible and lonely that must be, not to rush into needing to change anything or to shift the feelings that they're having, because it is a justified and understandable response to what's happening in that. I suppose what I've done with other young people where a worst case scenario event has happened, maybe around even a bereavement, is if this scenario happens, then what are the options available to us, with the understanding that none of them are perfect and are in the context of this horrible event having happened, but what can I do to give some degree of routine and certainty back into my life? So if a very difficult, traumatic and unpredictable event has happened, and this worst case scenario has happened, what we do try and encourage and try and support people to do is to find everyday things that they can start to get some predictability back in their life again. So be that, going back to work for a couple of hours or going back to a club, so that anxiety makes us feel like the world is a very, very uncertain place, and that when a catastrophic event or a very difficult event has happened, we can understandably believe that it's always going to happen and it's every day. So we need the direct experience of everyday interaction, seeing that they're somewhat predictable, even boring. That gives us some degree of anchoring in the world, that it's not always going to be as unpredictable, hard, and catastrophic as whatever we've gone through.
Thank you. Just there are a couple of questions just asking about recordings from the previous webinars, and just in case for people who haven't seen, Una has commented that they'll be setting up a library with all the other webinars that'll be available. Okay, I think that's all for questions. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah, that you're getting off slightly early today, Mark. So thanks very much to everybody for attending today's event. Thanks to yourself, Mark, for another wonderful webinar, and we will be recording it and we will send it out to everybody. Thanks to Erica for moderating the questions today. Job well done. And thank you to Jamie from Click Media for doing the tech business in the background. Our next event is on the 28th of October, and the focus on that one is anxiety for those who have had adverse childhood experiences, and we'll be sending around the poster in the next couple of days in relation to that. So that'll come through the schools, it'll come through any of the CYPSC networks. So if you're not involved in that and you'd like to attend the event, feel free to send me an email, una.caffrey@tusla.ie. So that's us for today, and we hope to see you all on the 28th of October. Thanks again, everybody.